Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with public policy in the great state of Texas. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and we are talking weather today with Dr. Becca Edwards, Texas Impact's Climate Action Fellow. This is a timely conversation for many reasons. Originally, because we wanted to talk about hurricane season, which begins this weekend, June 1st, and runs through November 30th. But also because it seems like most of Texas has endured at least one climate disaster in the last month. Our home is still without power after the storms that hit Dallas, Houston, and East Texas this week. We've had people in our community flood 4 times in the last month, homes that had previously never flooded. North Texas has had floods, tornadoes, and wind events. Houston had a wind event that knocked out most of downtown and had people without power for the better part of a week. How's the weather is starting to seem more like an apocalyptic inquiry rather than a meaningless conversation starter. And we haven't even made it to hurricane season yet. So we'll talk to Becca today. All that said, I do hope everyone is doing well. It's been great to see people come together to support their neighbors with cleanup efforts. I know those efforts will continue for weeks or even months, and I hope that support will last until everything is back to normal for everyone. But it's also a reminder that support for our neighbors is not reserved for after a disaster, but could be even more impactful if we can support our neighbors through good public policy that protects the well-being of all in society. And we'll definitely be talking about that in the coming weeks and months. This seems like an appropriate time to remember that the primary elections are now officially in the rearview mirror, and it is general election season. There are consequential elections taking place up and down the ballot, from the local school board to the presidential campaign. And we believe that democracy works best when the whole of the community is participating. And what better place to communicate the importance of elections than in our local congregations? And guess what? Texas Impact has tools for you to do just that. Head on over to texasimpact.org and check out the Texas Faith Votes campaign for tools and resources to engage your congregation and community. Now's the time to begin planning for how you plan to engage people this fall, so check it out and let us know if you have any questions. So that's enough wind up for today. I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Dr. Becca Edwards. Joining us for today's conversation is Texas Impact's Climate Action Fellow, Dr. Becca Edwards. Becca, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here, Scott.
I am glad you're here too, because we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about hurricanes with hurricane season beginning on June 1st, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before we get there, I feel like we have to talk about the spring storm season. I don't know if that's what we're calling it now, but the spring storm season that we just went through. I know many of our listeners have been impacted by severe weather over the last month, and many are still recovering. I'm on day 3 with no power in my house. Any reflections on what the state of Texas has gone through over the course of the last several weeks, or is this the new normal?
Yeah, it has been a super busy spring as far as severe weather goes. Of course, May is one of our big severe weather seasons. It's also part of one of the 2 rainy seasons that Texas has. So we would expect to see some severe weather this time of year no matter what. But I was just looking at the NOAA Storm Prediction Center website and counting the storm reports. And there were 16 days of with reports of either hail, tornadoes, wind, or all 3 in Texas in May. And May is not even over. And I counted those up yesterday, and already I saw a headline that Levelland, Texas had some damaging wind gusts in excess of 70 miles per hour just last night. So obviously this situation is still going on. I know a lot of people have been affected. There's been lots of damage. And it's hard to attribute any individual thunderstorm to climate change. But what I can say is that what all of these storms have in common is access to a really rich supply of water vapor and moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, which has had some really significant warming over the month of May. So that's fueled a lot of these severe storms. It's also fueled some of the really prolific precipitation that you've had out in East Texas. both the extreme precipitation and also the really, really hot weather that we had over Memorial Day weekend are examples of what the Texas State Climatologist Office says we can expect in a warming climate going forward. So we have seen about a 10% increase in precipitation totals in the eastern half of the state over climatological norms. But on top of that, what they project is an increase in extreme precipitation, which is the kind of precipitation that y'all have been seeing that's led to the flooding and all the disruption. So unfortunately, I think some of this is what we're expecting in a warming climate. So not necessarily a new normal, but something to be on the lookout for during our severe weather seasons and our rainy seasons.
Not loving that. I know we were at the swimming pool yesterday, or not yesterday, a couple days ago with the kids, and they had giant pumps that were pumping water from the lower regions. That is something I've never seen. And so it was a little shocking to the young people in my family. So speaking of water, there is a lot of water that's been falling throughout Texas, and we're not even to hurricane season yet. We've got a couple more days. As we were preparing for this, I didn't realize that you have some professional experience with hurricanes. Talk to us more about that.
Yeah, sure. In college, I was a research assistant for a professor in the atmospheric science department at Texas Tech, and his job was to study the wind in landfalling hurricanes. He and his team built 2 trailers that had towers mounted on top of them, and they would tow them to the coast and set them up when hurricanes were approaching. And then during the storm, the tower would collect data about the wind from the storm. And so I worked on that project my senior year in college, and then I decided to stay for graduate school. I eventually led that project for a couple of years. So in all, I've been to, I think, 12 landfalling hurricanes in my academic career, all the way from the lower Texas coast all the way to North Carolina. And I used the data that we collected in that project for my PhD research, where I compared the wind that we collected in hurricanes to wind that we see from extratropical systems, which is the normal wind we have around here, to see if there's a difference in the kind of turbulence that we see in those 2 different types of wind.
Becca, we've talked on this podcast several times and in real life lots of times, and I don't think I've ever heard you be more excited about a topic than you are talking about hurricanes, which kind of terrifies me, to be honest. But when we were getting ready to get on, you were so excited to talk about hurricanes. Talk to us about why you are so interested in this topic.
So, yeah, when I was a kid, I lived in South Florida for 5 years. That's where I went to elementary school. It's actually, as you know, an especially hurricane-prone part of the world. And I have 2 distinct memories about hurricanes from that time. One was when a hurricane was approaching our town, and my dad put the hurricane shutters on the windows of our house. And I just remember the inside of our house being totally dark for a few days. And I remember my parents and my sister and I would camp out on the living room floor. We were lucky to avoid any kind of serious impacts from that hurricane, but I remember that being exciting, and that sense of danger as a little kid is just kind of, it's one of those things that sticks with you for the rest of your life. A second memory was around the same time. I was in elementary school, and our normal routine was for me and my sister to walk home from school. But when the school let out that day, I got out to the parking lot, and my mom was standing there, and she had her pants rolled up real high, and it was raining really hard. And the 3 of us walked across a flooded parking lot to get in the car and go home. And that was a tropical storm that had made landfall and was bringing, really prodigious rain to our area that flooded the streets and flooded my school's parking lot. So again, as a kid, I was lucky to avoid serious impacts from hurricanes, but I do have some very early memories of sort of excitement and interest in the weather. And that sort of was the beginning of a lifelong interest and fascination with the weather and the physics behind what makes it work.
Interesting. That is interesting that you spent so much time and energy on research on this topic. Talk to us about how that research related to hurricane winds informs your current work on climate change.
Sure. Well, my my degree is half in atmospheric science. And so that's the study of the math and the physics and the chemistry behind what makes our atmosphere work. So that's, weather and climate are related in that it's the study of how our atmosphere works. Climate is just a larger scale understanding of weather. And so that background has been really helpful. As part of my job teaching undergraduates about climate science and earth science, I went to a number of workshops on things like using ice cores to get climate data, or using sediment cores, or teaching climate science. So all of those scientific items from my background have been super helpful in understanding sort of what drives climate change, what causes some of the climate impacts that we're seeing and that we're projected to see. But the second part of my job in my graduate program that's been really helpful is that I was housed in a research center that studies natural hazards from wind. And so that involved a lot of interaction with emergency managers, with thinking about disasters from a insurance perspective and from thinking about building codes. And so all of that experience has been super helpful in approaching climate from a policy angle.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned projections, because as those of us who live near the Gulf Coast know, hurricane season begins June 1st. Are there projections for this season, and what are we expecting?
So NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, recently they do this kind of projection every year of what they're anticipating for the hurricane season, and it's based on a number of different factors, including where we are in the El Nino Southern Oscillation Cycle. They talk about ocean temperatures and things like that. So based on all of those factors, NOAA has said that they're projecting an 85% chance of an above normal hurricane season. And they broke that down into they're expecting 17 to 25 total named storms. And as a reminder, a named storm is anything a tropical storm with winds of 39 miles per hour or stronger. And of those, they expect 8 to 13 to become hurricanes, which is winds above 74 miles per hour. And then they expect 4 to 7 major hurricanes, which is category 3 or higher hurricanes. So that's a big number, and it can sound really intimidating, but I would remind the listeners that many of those will probably not affect land. So we name the storms and we talk about them and classify them, even if they're not going to make landfall. So hopefully, even if we get some especially strong storms, they'll stay offshore, be scientifically interesting, and otherwise not cause a lot of problems.
You mentioned you've been tracking this for a long time, and since you were a kid, apparently. And anecdotally, it seems like these storms are getting more and more severe and more frequent. Is there any data behind that? Have you noticed any changes in activity over time?
So the biggest determinant of the strength of a hurricane is the water temperature, and not just the temperature at the surface, but how deep does that layer of warm water go? The hotter the water and the deeper the layer of hot water, the stronger the potential tropical cyclone is. And of course, there are many other factors that would determine the strength of a storm, but water temperature is really the fundamental one. As we've seen the oceans increase in temperature, like I mentioned earlier, the Gulf of Mexico, we have seen a difference in the way hurricanes intensify. So when I was doing the hurricane research in graduate school, so that would have been the early 2000s, when we watched a storm out in the Gulf or in the Atlantic, if it underwent what we call rapid intensification, which is when a storm gains 35 miles per hour of wind speed or more in a day, and that was pretty unusual. I remember Hurricane Katrina did that in the Gulf of Mexico right before landfall in Louisiana. Which was really devastating. So that kind of intensification was pretty unusual when I was working with hurricanes at Texas Tech. But what you may have noticed recently is that it seems like almost every single storm we had last year would be kind of identified and named as a hurricane, and then boom, overnight it would be much stronger. A really classic example of that is Hurricane Otis, which hit Acapulco last year, or the year before. I think it was last year. But it was a named tropical storm. They were anticipating it would make landfall as a Category 1 storm. It rapidly intensified overnight and made landfall as an extremely strong hurricane, causing really significant damage. And more importantly, it was a surprise. So the people that would have probably evacuated for a stronger storm were not able to. So it caused significant damage and disruption that way. So rapid intensification has increased in incidence. We see it much more often than we did 20 years ago, and that's a reflection of the much warmer ocean water that we have now.
And so what does that lead to? What hazards should Texans be especially mindful of as hurricane season approaches?
Yeah, so anytime a hurricane is approaching land, the things we worry about are wind and water. So wind makes sense. Hurricanes bring really strong wind. A lot of the building codes along the coast are designed to withstand winds up to 90 miles per hour. So if a hurricane's coming, you should also be concerned about protecting your windows and doors. You can use hurricane shutters or you can use plywood. And water can come in two different ways. One is storm surge, which is unique to hurricanes. That's a sort of elevated area of water that gets pushed in front of a hurricane as the hurricane approaches the coast. And when it reaches land, it can flood the coastal environment pretty far inland, depending on the topography. So they say with regard to evacuations that you should hide from wind, which means fortify your house as much as you can and then get into an interior room just like you would with a tornado and run from water. So if you are in an area that might see flooding from storm surge, then you should make an evacuation plan, find a relative or a friend you can stay with that's further inland, and plan to get yourself to safety that way. Another threat from a landfalling tropical cyclone that affects people beyond just the coastal environment is extreme precipitation. As we saw in Hurricane Harvey, which dropped more than 40 inches of rain over the southeastern corner of the state, that kind of flooding can be a huge problem, and it can be a big problem way far in from the coast from what you might expect from hurricane impact. So especially in this era of warmer water, more water vapor availability, that sort of thing. We got to watch for those precipitation impacts. And just like you would with any kind of storm that produces rain, know your house's flood risk and be prepared to respond if necessary.
As we mentioned, hurricane season does start next week. How would you recommend that people prepare, both, I guess, folks on the Gulf Coast and those who are further inland?
So if you're on the coast, I would recommend you understand the risks that your particular location faces. Are you at risk of storm surge? That would be based on your elevation, most likely. Is your house able to withstand strong winds? I guess unless you're an engineer, it'd be hard to know that yourself. But if your house was built relatively recently, it probably is engineered to withstand winds up to 90 miles per hour. You should also plan to have, the things you need to make yourself comfortable for several days without power. The electrical grid, we talk about it all the time recently, but, that's sort of one of the things that's been true for a long time is that hurricanes often knock out the electricity. So what kinds of non-perishable food do you need? What kind of medications do you need? Pet food. Make sure you have your shoes nearby. Things like that. What are you going to need to be comfortable for several days on your own without power? Oh, jugs of water, super important. If you do need to evacuate, consider what you would want to take with you and make sure that you are able to access those things quickly. So important paperwork, medication, valuable things that you'd like to keep with you. Make sure those are easy to find, easy to grab if you need to leave. For the rest of us who live inland, I think just having a plan, having a way to get weather information which is true any time of year in Texas. If you have like a weather radio or if you have an app on your phone that can give you information about storm warnings and that sort of thing, just stay aware of what's going on, how the conditions are changing around you, and be ready to respond.
Any other closing thoughts or shameless plugs you want to leave with us today? I know you have a group that's working on climate issues, right?
We do. We have the Climate Action Team, which meets Friday mornings at 10 on Zoom. We meet every week. If you'd like more information about that, go to the Texas Impact website. We would love to have you. It's a super friendly group, a safe place to ask questions and learn, and also a great way to get information about how to take action on climate.
Love that. Love that. Thanks for the time, Becca. Anything else before we close out?
Nope, nothing else, Scott.
All right. You're amazing. Thanks for the time, and we'll look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Becca, and I hope everyone is taking appropriate precautions, and that we all do the work necessary to address the systemic issues related to climate change. As always, Texas Impact has resources for you to learn more and get involved. Those resources and so much more are available online at texasimpact.org. While you're there, I hope you'll take a moment to sign up to be a member of Texas Impact. Your membership supports this podcast and all of the work to engage Texans of faith to advocate for a more just and equitable Texas. If you have questions about any of it, please reach out. You can catch me at scott@texasimpact.org. So with that, I think it's time to close out this episode. So remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.